Okay, so this is the start of our next set of lectures on forests of North America. So stepping a little farther away from our forests of North Carolina. So we'll move to the Northeast and across Canada and then into the Rocky Mountains and then the West. As you might guess, that we're not going to look at this on quite as high a resolution as we did for North Carolina and the Southeast. These are going to be kind of broad brush takes on these forest types, but it's important to know that their forests look a lot different depending on where you are. And of course, we're not even going to get to forests of the world, really. So I want you to be able to travel around North America and at least have a passing familiarity with the variation and diversity of forest types that we see on the continent. It's really pretty amazing and part of your education as dendrologists. So first, I'm going to start with a little introduction to the northeastern United States and the Great Lakes region. And our next lecture will be on Canada and boreal forests. So interestingly, this statistic here is 42% of the land is forested. I think I had a trivia question earlier in the semester about which state is the most forested, and that's Maine. So you can see that quite a lot of New England is still forested, and then we've got urban areas through the Midwest, and then you can see it also gets drier, and this is really important timberland. The non-forest is shown in white. The timberlands are extremely important, and so 32% of the entire US timberland is found in this region, and also 41% of the US population. So there's definitely intersections of natural forests with urban environments and people. So that's one of the kind of threats. You'll see a lot of the threats are tied to threats that are considered human threats rather than natural disturbances. So important take-homes here, more than 40% of this land is forested. Most of the species that we see in this region, it's still the eastern part of the United States, and many of these species are also found in North Carolina. And if they're not the exact same species, often they're familiar genera. So we will learn a few new species, ones that we don't learn in lab, but are important to know about, of main timber species or forest species that are in this region. And then more than a third of the US wood volume comes from the Northeast. So that is a really important distinction. Very commercially valued. And then also, as I was saying, parts of this region are really densely populated. So these are tensions that exist between the natural environment and human environment. Most of the forestry that's being done here is through natural regeneration. So when you learn about that, if you're a forester and you're taking classes through regeneration at NC State, right, we do a lot of planting here in the Southeast, but that's not the case elsewhere. So that's also really important for you to know about. So this map is from the Forest Inventory and Analysis data from the US Forest Service, and I have a link to it there if you want to look at that farther. So in this lecture, we're going to look at several types of forest, and some of them probably will sound familiar to you. Oak-Hickory forest, maple, which is shown in the light green, lime green here. The Maple-Beech-Birch forest, which is shown in the bright blue color. The white pine-Hemlock-Northern Hardwoods forest, and that is shown in the kind of the magenta color. And then we have spruce fir shown in kind of the pink color on the farther northern parts. The first thing we're going to do, though, is talk about what environmental factors change as you go north. So how is this region different from North Carolina and what we've already learned? So colder, not surprisingly, right? At the higher latitudes, we do have slightly changes in the precipitation. So this is by and large a drier region than southeastern United States. And then the other factors are at play that vary, kind of regionally and then locally: geology and soil, the disturbance or lack of disturbance, and then time and space. So that's there's an interesting story in there that we'll get to in this lecture. So really importantly, glaciation is actually a factor in these kinds of landscapes. And you can see the last ice age brought the Laurentide ice sheet down through the Appalachians, but not really so much in the south. So The forests in North Carolina were never glaciated, but this is definitely alters the landscape of places where there was once an ice sheet. So that alters the landform. You have young topography. And so right underneath an ice sheet, there's no vegetation, there's no seed bank, there's really nothing that can live underneath those ice sheets. And so when they melt and recede, you have primary succession in place. And so you have the earliest plants that come in, unlike a timber harvest that sets back to secondary succession, which we talked about for the Piedmont of North Carolina. Primary succession, you're starting from scratch. So all you have is mineral soil, generally poor nutrient availability. And so soil develops over time. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to boreal forests, but this is an important factor for these forests. A little bit of tree trivia. This photo is from Mount Katahdin in Maine, taken from, which is the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. So how high is that summit of Mount Katahdin, which is the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail? What do you think the elevation is? Okay, so you might be surprised to learn that it's actually below 6,000 feet, so below most of our highest peaks in the Black Mountains and Smokies in North Carolina, so 5,260 feet. And then here's the follow-up question. Looking at this photo, it's very rocky and there's no trees. All you can see vegetation-wise are lichens. So the summit of Mount Mitchell is forested at 6,600 feet. Why is this not forested? So, and here's the photo of the summit for Mount Katahdin, a landmark for people who thru hike the Appalachian Trail. So the answer to that is that climatic tree line is at about 4,000 feet, right? Latitude makes a difference, right? So that's the temperature part of the story. As you go north, you have cooler temperatures, and so you reach a place where trees cannot survive year round. And so you are above tree line, right? So that occurs at 4,000 feet and you can see it, unlike the area in the Southern Appalachians where we live. So there's several mountain ranges that make up the Northern Appalachians, right? We group them together, but just like the Southern Appalachians consist of the Smokies and the Blacks and Balsam Mountains, we have different mountain ranges that comprise the Northern Appalachians. So you've got the Adirondacks in New York State. You've got the Green Mountains, which are most of the Vermont. You've got the Berkshires in Massachusetts, and then the White Mountains, which extend in New Hampshire and Maine. And Mount Katahdin is part of that White Mountain range. There's a few others on this map here. So let's talk about the major environmental factors that influence this region's forests. Right, so precipitation-wise, it's slightly drier than North Carolina, and when we talk about temperature, not only are the winter temperatures much colder and winters are much more severe than they are further south, but the growing season is extremely short, and so the trade-offs that trees need to make are: is the growing season long enough for them to generate enough photosynthate to keep going through the year? And when the answer to that question becomes no, you've moved above climatic tree line. The past glaciation affects soils and also the site index for forestry, right, which is based on available nutrients. Disturbance is a factor here. Interestingly, the fire interval is very long compared to anywhere in North Carolina. So you might say that there's a fire dependent forest, but we're talking about fires on a 100 to 300 year interval. And then finally, the threats are very much related to humans. We'll talk about a number of invasive species that have impacted many of the timber species and forest types in this region. And so just a quick recap, right? These are the forest types that we're going to look at today: the Oak-Hickory forest, Maple-Beech-Birch, white pine, hemlock, northern hardwood, and spruce fir. So a lot of these forest types, when I show you photos of them, are going to look pretty familiar to similar types that we have in North Carolina. So our first one here, so this might look, the trees are very large, but this might look like a forest. If you didn't know otherwise, this could be a forest in North Carolina. So this is an example of the Oak-Hickory forest. And this is really an extension of the Oak-Hickory forest that we have in North Carolina. So you can see The dark green is showing Oak-Hickory forest as it extends up through the Appalachian Range. So this forest type should be very familiar to you. So interestingly, one of the commercial aspects of this forest is fuel wood. And so you'll have a stand, and if they coppice it or harvest the above ground biomass, it will resprout. Many trees will resprout from the root system. And so that's actually a timber practice called coppicing, and that can produce fuel wood. So that's important. And then there was old field pine as part of this forest type, but almost all of it was cut in the early 1900s. And so at that point, you already had an understory of different oak species. And so by cutting off the old field pine, that basically released the oaks, right? The oaks were then able to take advantage of all those additional resources now available. They were already in the understory. And so that kind of spurred and hastened the development of the Oak-Hickory forests that are in the northeastern United States. So what species are found in these Oak-Hickory forests? Well, a lot of these are familiar species to you. One thing that's important to know, though, is farther north, we have a lower biodiversity. So fewer species, but many of them are the same. So we have northern red oak in these forests, and then other oaks that could be present are white oak, black oak, scarlet oak, and chestnut oak, right? But it's not nearly the diversity of oaks that we have in the Southeast. The overall species diversity is much lower. So it would be easy for you to go up north and be pretty quickly become an expert in dendrology up there. And then, just like other oak hickory forests we've studied, the older stands develop this complex structure over time. So as the canopy trees get larger, there's some shade in the understory, and shade tolerant species will start to develop. You can also see in this photo that there's some herbaceous species in the understory as well. So moving on, so this is photos of 3 different forests featuring different species, right? With sugar maple on the far left, American beech in the middle, and this is actually American beech on the far right. So these kinds of forests, right? We've already looked at a forest type that had maple, beech, and birch, right? Very similar to our northern hardwood forests in the southeastern United States. So this Maple-Beech-Birch forest in the northeast is in this blue region, so it's fairly extensive. A little bit different out here in the lake states than it is in the northeast. A lot of this area has fertile soils. So some of these are areas that were not recently glaciated, and so they tend to have more fertile soils, and thus they were converted to agriculture. And the main species here are a little different than some of the species in North Carolina, but sugar maple, Acer saccharum, beech, the Fagus grandifolia that we have here, and yellow birch, Betula allegheniensis. There's a mesophytic forest type that's recognized to the south, so shown here in West Virginia, and this is very similar to the Cove hardwood forest, so much farther south, few more species, more of those rich Cove hardwood species. So looking at sugar maple, Acer saccharum, this is a species that looks a whole lot like our southern sugar maple. And we do actually, you can see on the range map, it does extend out into North Carolina mountains, and there's some very large examples. This photo was taken at Big Ivy outside of Asheville. And you can see this beautiful, rich understory, great place for spring wildflowers, but the northern distribution ranges into Canada. It's not shown on this map. And so this is the northern species of maple that's most common. And commercially, it's really valuable for as a source of maple sugar and maple syrup. This is a pretty amazing process that I got to witness with my family when we went up to visit Canada. It takes 40 gallons of sap from a sugar maple tree to make 1 gallon of syrup. And so this is a photo of a grove where they have buckets hung and there's little spigots so that sap is collected. We went and visited this, and this is in Quebec, and you can see the holes where the same trees are tapped year after year. This is the owner of a sucrerie in Quebec and Sucre de la Montagne, right? Sugar of the mountain in Rigaud, Quebec. And this is a sucrerie, which is commonly known as a sugar shack. They use the traditional methods the French Canadians use to harvest the maple syrup. And we were not there at the right time to see that actually in action, but the owner or proprietor took us through and showed us the process. He showed us the different grades of syrup. Interestingly, the syrup is very light early on in the season, and then it darkens over time. So that's the sap that comes out of the tree. And there's a really interesting tradition in Quebec where these sugar shacks exist. And so they actually get like this place seated, a couple hundred people, and they have this traditional sugar shack meal, which of course features maple sugar very prominently. And, this place has music and these huge tables. So it was pretty interesting to visit. American beech is an important component of these forests as well, right? So this is classic northern hardwood species that you know how to identify already. And up north, it is infected by beech bark disease. This is part of the natural history in your lab sheet. And this is a scale insect that transmits and triggers this neonectria bacterium, which causes these cankers, right? So we know American beech by this, beautiful, smooth, light gray bark, and it causes these awful cankers and that eventually kill the tree. The forests re-sprout from the root systems, but they are soon reinfected. So this is a similar case to American chestnut, where the trees can't attain any reasonable size before they're infected and die off. You can see how this has spread throughout the Northeast. And I was visiting the Cooperative Extension, or I guess it was the Cooperative Extension Forest Group in Maine, right, which focuses on silviculture. And on this field tour, they took us to this area where there's, these beech trees, and you can see they're all infected with this beech bark disease. And so what happens is, because they keep resprouting, the forests become this like really dense with beech. It has no commercial value. And so it's a real problem for the timber industry in Maine and other parts of the Northeast. We also have yellow birch. So this is a more dedicated northern species, right? So you can see that on the range map. It does extend down into the southern Appalachians. This photo was taken actually, I think up near Mount Katahdin. So this is Betula allegheniensis, so yellow birch. And I also, just because it's so cool, I have to talk a little bit about paper birch, Betula papavera. And you can see that's a true northern species, not one we have in North Carolina, but this is the birch that people made birch bark canoes out of. And so this photo was taken from a traditional wooden boat museum that was on the edge of Lake Ontario. And this was a true birch bark canoe. So I always thought that was really interesting. The birches that I grew up around, could never imagine how you would make an actual boat out of them. But this is that white, peely paper birch that you may have run across in your travels. Another species that's very common is black cherry. Remember, we've talked about how this is the highest quality wood for black cherry, comes from central and western Pennsylvania. You can see, which is really kind of in the center of its range. This is what the tree looks like when it gets very large. We don't really encounter that very commonly in North Carolina, although sometimes in the mountains. So it gets this very, very dark black, flaky, we call it, say it looks like burnt potato chips on the bark. And so what species from our southern northern hardwood forest is missing here? Right, so the answer to that is buckeye, right, which is more of a southern species. And then you can also see, it's not labeled here, but there's a maple basswood forest is what's found here in the lake state. So it's a slight shift in species composition, but the same kind of habitat. Basswood, or Tilia americana, is a really cool species. The fibrous inner bark was used for fiber by Native Americans, and it's very soft and lightweight wood. And so it was once used for prosthetic limbs because of its light, easily worked character, and also fairly lightweight. And so here's a picture of basswood. This is taken from Montreal. This is a park in Montreal, and you can see this really, really furrowed bark. They have cool leaves too. And you can see that basswood is not found in the Piedmont or coastal plain of North Carolina, but it is an eastern species. So moving on to our next forest type, You might look at this and notice that we've got, looks like some beech here, and then also some white pine. You can see that from the bark. And also this is another example, right? So this is yellow birch with its peeling bark and some evergreen trees. So this is a broad forest type called white pine-Hemlock-Northern hardwoods. So it's kind of a transitional type, so it doesn't fit very neatly into any one category. But if you look at where these forests are located, there are deciduous forests to the south, right? This is primarily an evergreen forest. You have boreal forests to the north. And this forest type is also slightly different in the lake states. So in New England, the primary species are Tsuga canadensis, eastern white pine, Pinus strobus, and then the northern hardwood species, beech, northern red oak, red pine, sugar maple, and yellow birch. So that, in this case, that group of northern hardwoods is slightly different than what we call northern hardwoods in the southeast. I have a photo thrown in here. This is, you look at the leaves and the venation on the leaves. This is the cutest cornice you'll ever see. This is Cortus borealis. So it's a little tiny dogwood shrub that's only about a foot off the ground with these really lovely little flowers, and bracts, of course. So eastern hemlock we know is a stream-loving species. How do you know from the photo on the left that is eastern hemlock? What are the white things on the backs of those leaves? So those are stomates. And so you can see the 2 rows of stomates there. Eastern hemlock has been really decimated by the hemlock woolly adelgid, so most of the old growth forest is gone of this tree type. We have white pine, which you can see extends into the southeast and then also westward to the lake states, Pinus strobus. And I want to do a quick summary or comparison of white pine versus the yellow pines. So we've learned several southern yellow pines in lab this semester, but only one eastern white pine. We'll learn a couple other white pines before the end of the semester. So eastern white pine is sometimes called soft pine, and it's easily distinguished from the southern yellow pines because there are 5 needles per fascicle instead of 2 or 3. The fascicle sheath is deciduous, so it's not very prominent. You often, don't see it, or it's not very noticeable. The cone scales on the cones for eastern white pine are thin and they're not armed, so they're kind of flat. The cones are elongated. The wood is soft and lower density, so it's, on one hand, it's not very strong, but it's easier to work with. So it's more often used for things like molding and window frames. Whereas southern yellow pine is a harder wood with higher density, and it can be used for applications like flooring or even, pulp where strength is required, like paper bags. So that's a quick comparison between our eastern white pine, considered a soft pine, with southern yellow pines, which are considered a hard pine. So here's our Pinus strobus, eastern white pine. So you may remember this from lab. So it puts on basically 1 flush of branches each year. And so you can kind of see in this photo, right? You can easily tell the age of a tree by counting the rolls of branches from the bottom to the top, although the bottom ones usually get pruned off. This is an early successional species. It responds to disturbance. But again, disturbance in the Northeast, it comes on a lot longer interval than it does in the Southeast. So they think that white pine has a 100 to 300 year fire interval. There's a lot of room for that. And it's not a fire tolerant species, so it will die with fire. So I want to look at this, let's look and see where these forests are found. So on this chart, it's sometimes called white-red jack pine group, right? Shown in the magenta color. And it doesn't look like these forests are very extensive, but they really are. They're just there's a little bit up here in the northeastern United States. Then you can see some in Michigan and Wisconsin, and a little bit farther west. So like I said, it's a transitional between boreal forest to the north and deciduous trees to the south. When you get over into the lake states, remember I said this forest looks different depending on whether you're in the northeastern United States like New England versus the lake states. So in the lake states, we still have eastern hemlock, still have white pine. So that's why it's called the same forest type. And then in addition to that, you have jack pine, Pinus bankesiana, and red pine, Pinus resinosa. So let's look at that. just briefly, I'm going to show you the range maps for those two species. Some of them do come up into, right, Jack pine is found in Maine, and red pine has got a little bit more widespread distribution, but it's really prominent in these forests in the lake states. So we're going to talk about those more when we talk about boreal forests. They're a lot more important in those. So let's talk for a moment about threats to forests in this region. So there is a huge number of invasive species that have impacted the canopy forest species, right? So you have American chestnut, beech, I talked about the beech bark disease, and white pine, there's blister rust. And there's also, this is another human-caused disturbance, right? Overpopulation of white-tailed deer has really impacted forest regeneration. They're browsers, so they tend to eat woody vegetation. And so they can really clean out the understory of a forest because of that browsing impact, right? In the past, white-tailed deer were hunted by apex predators, but we don't have any apex predators in this region anymore. And so that's led to an overpopulation. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. And then development, right? So earlier in the lecture, I said that a huge percentage of the US population, 42% of the US population lives in this region. And so that puts a lot of pressure on natural stands and natural forests. And then we also have impacts from climate shifts and the shifts of ranges of certain species. So this map is from a recent study in the Eastern United States that looks at the range of certain hardwood species in the Eastern United States. And you can see that where the forest started is in light green, and then where it ended up is in dark green, and that's over 30 years. And so what they found was that, you know, if you look at the general arrows, most of them are pointing, many of them are pointing to the west. So on average, hardwoods ranged west at an average rate of 1.5 kilometers each year, right? While softwoods shifted north at an average of 1 kilometer per year. So, you know, it's not like the trees picked up their roots and walked north or walked west, right? But the seedlings thrived in areas where they formerly did not. And so that's really notable. We may see, we will certainly see further shifts in the general range of many species. I just wanted to show this chart, which shows the threats from invasive species. And so in addition, right, we talked about chestnut blight, we've talked about beech bark disease, and white pine blister rust. In lab, we've talked about butternut canker. So these are all pathogens that have killed populations of some of our important tree species. And then in yellow, these are invasive plants that have taken over and displaced some of the native species, right? So these actually came in much earlier in our history. The pathogens are a much more recent phenomenon. And then we have invasive insects, right? Starting with the gypsy moth, which was here in the mid 1800s. And then you can see hemlock woolly delgid that we've talked about. Asian long-haired beetle, longhorned beetle, and emerald ash borer are species that we're currently on the watch for here in North Carolina. And often these are species that are coming from that northeastern United States, Great Lakes region. So a quick recap, right? So most of the forests in the Northeast and lake states, if you go up and visit those forests, they will look familiar to you. They don't look very foreign. They are very similar to our southeastern forests with a lot of overlap in species. And we see Oak-Hickory forests extend through the Appalachians. Some of the key species are some of the oaks that we're familiar with, as well as hickories, although a lot of the oaks that are more endemic to the southeast are not found in that area. Maple-Beech-Birch forests kind of grade into cove hardwood forests on the south in richer soils that weren't glaciated. And then maple-basswood forests to the west in the lake states, right? So those are two variants of the same forest type. I like to think of those as most like our northern hardwood forests. Then we've got the white pine-Hemlock-Northern hardwood forest. So this is a transition between deciduous northern hardwood forests and then boreal forest types. And then to the west, where it's drier, those northern those northern hardwood species are replaced with jack and red pine. And, you know, all of these forests are threatened by invasive species as well as invasive diseases and pathogens. Climate change is a significant threat for these forests. And then finally, with the huge percent, 41% of the nation's population lives in this region, development is an issue as well. And that's a wrap.